Hello and welcome to part 7 of creating a simple 3D move and dodge game using the Godot game engine. My name is Colin, and in this tutorial series we're creating this simple 3D move and dodge game where you are a ball, you move around a three-dimensional maze, you avoid hitting enemies, you collect coins. If you collect all the coins, you win the game. If you accidentally hit an enemy, you go to the game over screen and you have to start all over again. In this video, we're going to go over how to create enemies that are animated in the level. So let's go ahead and break this video down. Number one, we're going to be creating an enemy scene from a model that we're bringing in from Blender 2.8. Second, we're going to animate that enemy. Yep, that's pretty straightforward. But enemies are kind of useless unless something actually happens or we have some place to go if you hit the enemy. So we're going to create a very quick game over screen, but we did go over how to create simple menus in the last tutorial in this mini series, so I'll be going over that quite quickly. Next up, we're going to program collision detection so that our enemy knows when it's hit our character, and if that collision is detected, we can send our player to the game over screen for them to go ahead and try again. And last but not least, we're going to add more enemies. This might sound redundant, but it can be a little bit tricky to animate and have different animations on different enemies, so we'll cover that in the last part of this video. Of course, if you have not seen the first 6 videos in this mini-series on how to create a simple 3D move and dodge game, I'll put a link to this playlist on the screen right now. And of course, if you like this video or if you learned something, go ahead and click on that like button below this video on YouTube. It really helps me and my channel out. And if you want to see more videos like this one in Godot or Blender or technology, click on that subscribe button and click on the bell icon to get notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. We're going to start off in the Godot game engine just to recap what we did in the last video. In the last video, we made a simple menu with some text that uses a font and a button that we can actually click to switch us between this screen and the level scene in our game. Between the last video and this video, I did something that I said that I was going to do. I adjusted the camera and where it is and what it can see in the game because it wasn't quite optimal, and I changed the speed of the ball. So just very quickly, if I select Steve's, our character, our ball Steve's camera target, and I'm kind of orbit around, you can see it's right here. I changed its position and its rotation. So I moved it around, and then I went and I played my scene, and I looked and saw if I liked where the camera was and if it was framed nicely. I also took the camera, this interpolated camera, and I adjusted the field of view, this FOV value. In other words, how wide angle or how zoomed in the camera is. The camera's way back there right now. So a larger field of view means a wider camera angle. So now if I go ahead and play this scene, you can see that we can see our ball in the middle of the level, and the ball stays nicely kind of in the middle of the screen roughly, or I think it's pretty good. So the camera's a little bit lower and it can see more all at the same time. The other thing I did was I sped the ball up. So if I go to Steve and I look at Steve's script file, all I had to do to make Steve move faster were change the values of these two constants, speed and rotation speed, and I just turned those two numbers up because, of course, if you make your character move faster because it's a ball, it has to roll faster as well. I believe these numbers were something like 5 and 6 or 6 and 7 before, so I basically doubled the speed of the ball, and I like that. Let's go ahead and get an enemy from Blender 2.8 into Godot. So I'm going to minimize, I'll go back to my 3D view and then minimize Godot, and in Blender 2.8 this is my rather not so creative enemy. It's a little spiky ball, kind of themed after one of those massage medicinal balls that you roll your foot on or you put on your back and you roll on the floor. It has a material, although right now in Blender 2.8 I'm in solid view up here, so if I switch into look dev view, it's got a shiny purple material on it, and I also have everything in this scene selected. So I've got the camera and the lamp there too. They're selected, so I'm going to just right click, or actually pardon me, left click on the ball to select it in Blender 2.8, and then I want to get this to a GLTF file. So we're going to go to export. So file and export, and with that one object selected, I'm going to go to GLTF 2.0, and when we do that, I'm going to go to my desktop and then go into my project folder, Godot Basic Move and Dodge Game. And then if I go into imports, here I'm going to save my GLTF of the enemy object. And by the way, before I do this, I need to make sure that my enemy is named. So I might want to go with it selected to the object tab and make sure I've named the object, which I have. And I want to make sure that its material is named something that's not just material. I caught myself. So I'm going to name this enemy dash material, and hopefully I cannot make a typo while I'm typing that, and I'll press enter. So we do this because Godot will get confused between materials if we have two materials from different objects named the same thing. Okay, really quickly, file and export GLTF 2.0, and I'm going to go to my project folder on my desktop and go into imports and enemy, and I need to change a couple of settings down here under my export settings. I need to make sure I'm exporting as a GLTF embedded, so not a binary but an embedded, and I want to make sure that I use only selected objects, so it'll only export the ball and not the camera and the lamp. Okay, export GLTF 2.0. It'll just take a sec and it should be done. So now if I open up Godot, it will quickly import it, and now we've got it in our imports folder as enemy.gltf. I can double click on it, and it's saying I need to make a new scene. And so I'm going to say not the default. I'm going to say open anyway. That's important. I find this easier to work with. Once you have this new enemy scene with the purple spiky enemy ball, I'm going to save this scene. So scene, save scene as, because I'm saving it as a new scene essentially, and I'm in the imports folder, so I'm going to go up one with this little up arrow, and I'm going to go into assets, and I'm going to name this enemy.tscn. That works for me. I'll click on save. Now that we have our own actual Godot scene file, I can edit it. Okay, so this scene root, I don't want it to be a spatial node. That's what that is right now. So I can actually right click on it, and I'm going to change its type. Our enemy is actually going to be a new kind of an object. We don't need our enemy to be a physics object at all, actually. We just need to be an area. An area is under spatial, and I might not be able to, there it is, under collision object. I don't know if I'd be able to find it or not. There it is. An area will not bounce or hit or be able to push or interact in a physicsy kind of a way with other objects in your scene. And that's okay for an enemy, because an enemy doesn't do any of those things. We don't need to bump into our enemy. We just need to know if we are coming into contact with our enemy. So once we do, we're going to switch scenes anyway, so there's no physics involved here, but it can detect collisions, and areas are really good at detecting collisions. So area, and I'm going to change this type. So now we have this scene root, which I will actually call, I'll rename my enemy mesh into enemy mesh, and then this area will be called enemy. Okay, it's giving me a little error, and hopefully you know what that's about. It says this node has no shape, so it can't collide or interact with other objects. Consider adding a collision shape or collision polygon as a child to define its shape. You've seen this before. We need to add a collision shape node as a child of this object. Even though it's not a physics object, we need to define its size or area or shape. So with enemy selected, not the mesh, but the area, I'll press plus. We're going to just search for collision shape, and there it is, the pink one, not any of the 2D blue ones, so collision shape. And this one's giving me an error because it needs to know its shape. So with collision shape selected, I'm going to go over to shape and say, hey, it's a sphere. So I'm going to say new, where is it? New sphere shape. And it's too small, or is it? Let's go into orthogonal view, and let's go into front view. And let's see how we're doing here. Yes, I believe it was too small. So I can drag the little pink handle out, or I can look at its properties. If I click on sphere shape, its radius, I believe it needs to be 2. Yeah, that's the right shape because we got it from Blender and it was basically made from a default cube. So hey, it's a radius of 2, so it's 4 across. Okay, so hopefully that will work. I'm going to do a Control S to save this enemy scene. I'm going to go back into my level, and actually first thing that I'll do is I'm going to delete this box because it's not actually going to be a part of my final game. Sorry to see you go, but I'm going to grab the box 1 and I'm going to right click and say delete nodes, and yeah, box is gone because we're going to select the level. And I'm not going to press the plus, I'm going to press the little link button. We're going to make instances of our enemy. So I'm going to press the little link button, and where is it? It should be in assets and enemy.tscn. That's our scene file that we actually customize in Godot, not our gltf enemy. Okay, that's important. So I'm going to press open. And there is the enemy, and you know what? It's way too big, so I thought that might happen. We can actually go back because this is instanced. Any change that I make to the original enemy scene will get propagated back into any instances of it. So if I go to the enemy scene and I go to my enemy mesh and I open up its transform properties and its scale is set to 1, 1, and 1, I can change that to 0.5, 0.5, and 0.5, and now the ball is half. Yeah, its overall width, so it's quite a lot smaller in volume. And now its collision shape, the sphere, is way too big, so I'm going to change its radius to 1 over in its inspector properties. Okay, if I do a quick Control S and then I go back to my level, you can see the ball is now the right size, so I can move it up perhaps, and I might go to my orthogonal front view and I might move it around, and I might have to orbit and see where I think it belongs. You kind of just have to eyeball this, or you could look at your transform properties, and I think 1 might actually be the right height, but it can be hard to tell. So I'm going to put this enemy where I think it should go. We're going to have multiple enemies, but let's go in orthogonal view. Let's go up to our top view, and I'm going to put my first enemy, let's say we're going to animate in an L shape, kind of moving. I'm going to use the move tool. It's going to animate kind of starting right about there and going to there and then going down and then doing that in a nice little L shape loop. We're not going to get much more complicated or simple than that in this video. So I'm going to start it off right here, and we have to animate it. How do you do that? Well, to our enemy, we're going to add a child node called an animation player. So I'm going to select enemy. In fact, I'm going to rename him enemy 1 and press enter. I'm going to press with him selected the plus button, and I'm going to look for the node. Let's see if I can find it without searching. Called animation player. It's just right there under node. So I'm going to select it, press create. Animation player is now a child of enemy 1. And when you have an animation player on a node, you actually get a new bottom panel down here called animation. And you can name an animation once you make it, but this area down here that's empty right now is essentially going to be filled with tracks with keyframes on it over a timeline. And what are we animating? Well, you can actually animate. If you select an animation player that belongs to a node, you can actually animate any of its parents' properties. Now, first off though, we actually have to make a new animation. So I'm going to click on this word animation, which is actually a button for a menu, and I'm going to say new. And I'm going to name this animation, guess what? Enemy 1 animation. It's a very creative name, I know. So I'm going to press OK, and once I do that, I get what looks kind of like a timeline. And now if I select my enemy, look what I have. I have all these little key icons next to most of the properties in my game, including under the transform category over here, the translation, which means movement. I've got a little key there, and rotation, which we're also going to use to roll the little spiky balls around. So the idea here is that you create tracks for animation only on the properties that you want to animate. So with my enemy one selected, I'm going to press a little key next to translation, and it says create new track for property translation and insert a key. Yes, so I'm going to press create. And when I did that, down at the bottom, you can see I've got a translation track and a keyframe. This is a lot like Blender, if you're familiar with Blender and its timeline, or Blender 2.8's new timeline with keyframes that you can actually move, which look like diamonds, which is a lot like Blender 2.7's dope sheet editor window. Okay, so if I go later in time just by dragging this little playhead bar, and the weird thing about Godot is that you can only drag it in this top section that has numbers in it. You can't drag it anywhere down here. That's a little quirk of Godot. Our timeline right now, though, is only 1 second. So we can change that. Over on the far right of that window, there's a 1 here, and that's the duration of my animation. So I'm going to say, well, let's think about this. My ball is going to go, or the enemy is going to go probably in about 1.5 seconds. It's going to get to here, and then it's going to move down in probably 2 seconds down to here. So that's 3.5 seconds, and then we need 3.5 seconds to get back because we want to create a loop. So that's 7 seconds altogether. 3.5 plus 3.5. Okay, so I'm going to make this animation be 7 seconds. So I'll type 7 in there, press enter. It looks like it's grayed out here, but that's just the active area, and you can only drag your playhead in that area. So now I'm going to drag my playhead to 1.5 seconds. It's measured in seconds, and I'm going to move my enemy to right about there, and I need to insert a keyframe. So I'm going to press the little key button next to my property. So I'll press this key button, and I've got a keyframe there. So now I've got animation. Let's keep going. I'm going to go to 3.5, and I'm going to move my enemy to right about there. And I'm going to press the little key button next to translation. Don't press one of the wrong key buttons. That's important. And so now we've got an animation in an L shape. And now what I can do is I can actually duplicate this keyframe just by clicking on it, and if I put my playhead where I want that keyframe to go, so at 5.5 seconds, I can actually, I believe, just right click on it and say duplicate keys, and it'll put the duplicated copy where your playhead is. So right click duplicate keys, and there we go. So now it goes back up to that spot, and again I'm going to duplicate this one at the beginning. So I'll click on it, and then I'll put my playhead at the last frame at 7 seconds. And if I right click on this keyframe, it's a little bit tricky because you can't right click over by its name. So you got to right click right on the edge of it and say duplicate keys. So now we have an animation of the ball moving. Rotation works the same way, although we have to kind of guesstimate how much the ball will rotate. So I'm going to select my enemy and go to rotation degrees and click the little key icon. I'm at frame or the 0 seconds on my timeline. So I'm going to press rotation degrees, that little key, and yes, create. And now this is where I might want to orbit into a view where I can see what I'm doing here. We are rotated in this way on this keyframe. I'm going to go to where it gets to that corner, and it will have rolled. So at this point in time, I'm going to grab my rotation tool, and if I rotate it on the Z-axis, this is where you can see how many degrees I'm rotating, and I can just type in here as well. So I'm going to guess that it's going to rotate 270 degrees, and I'm going to press the key button, and now I'm going to guess and check. So I guessed, and is it rolling in the right way? I think it kind of is. So I'm not going to be too accurate for this. This is our first project, so I'll just leave it at that. It rolls a longer distance, so I might go to here, and I'm rotating now on the red x-axis, so I'm going to rotate it just a little bit so I can see which one I'm going to do. I'm going to use this one here, and I'm going to say 400 degrees that way. Okay, I'm going to press the little key button there. So now if I scrub through, it looks like it's doing the right thing. Okay, and the same idea here, I'm going to roll in the opposite direction. So I'm going to select this keyframe, go to 5.5, and then right click on it and say duplicate. And then I'll go to 7 seconds and select this one and say right click duplicate keys. And so now I have my enemy's animation. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like in our game. Right now I'm looking at my scene through orthographic view or orthogonal, so I'll go back into perspective just so I can see that it does have a shadow. And it's floating a little bit. That might be a problem. I might have to go back and revisit all my keyframes and move it down a little bit on each one, but I'm not going to worry about that for the sake of the length of this video. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like. I'll do a Control S to save, and then play scene. And as you can see, it's not animating because we haven't actually told the enemy to animate or actually play its animation. So I'm going to close my preview and select my enemy's animation player. What I have to do here is first check or press this little circular button, which means loop the animation, because we want to have the animation play over and over and over and over again. Next up, we have to make this action here, enemy 1 animation, I use the word action, that's a Blender word, but this animation play by default right when the game first loads. To do that, I'm going to press this little A plus tag looking button, and if it turns blue, that means it's set to be true, and this is the autoplay option. You can do this with code as well, although this is the easier way. So now if I do a quick Control S to save and play this scene, you can see that now we have an enemy and it's rolling, and it's really not rolling in quite the way I was hoping. So I'm going to pause the video here and see why that's happening, because it's obviously twisting in a way that I don't like there. Alright, so I think I figured it out, and let's go ahead and fix this problem together. I went and I selected my animation player so I can see my enemy 1 animation, and if I look at the enemy and its translation, specifically its rotation degrees field right here with X, Y, and Z, and if I look at what's changing here, when it rotates from here over to here, it's rotating on the Z axis. So if I go and watch this value, and if I kind of scrub along my timeline, when I get to this point, it's rotated this way to 270 degrees. Now, when it rotates from this point to its final point before it resumes and does the animation in reverse, it's rotating now on the x-axis. You can see this value over here is increasing all the way to 400, but for some reason, and I'm not sure exactly why, the Z value is changing when it shouldn't. So it's rolling almost back a whole bunch, and even beyond 0, it's going to -90 when it should stay at 270. So I'm going to just go to this middle keyframe, and where it's right at the end, I'm going to change this value manually to 270. And I'm going to press the little key button. So now if I watch these values, yeah, it's staying at 270 degrees from 1.5 seconds in all the way to 3.5 seconds in, and then it's staying to 270 all the way until it gets back to this point, which is exactly what I want to do, but it is rotating on the X between 1.5 seconds to 3.5 seconds, and then it's rotating in the opposite direction to go back from 400 all the way back to 0 here. So I'm not sure why I had to do that, but I think this will solve it, and then from 5.5 to 7 seconds, it should rotate, or the Z rotation should go back down to 0. So let's go ahead and save this scene and play the scene and see what it looks like. and it seems to look pretty good, and it's playing and it's looping. So now we have to get it to actually hurt us, because I can go through this. Remember, it's not a collision, or it's not a physics object, so it's not going to bump into me, it's not going to push me along, and I can't push it. So we're going to enable collision detection. Let's go ahead and add that. One of the nice things about an area node, which is the basis or root node of our enemy scene, is that if I select the enemy over here in the scene dock and then go over to the node tab beside the inspector and look at the available signals that are available on an area, you can see that each node type has its own category, and different nodes like area have different signals or default event handler signals that are specialized for that kind of node. And areas are really good at detecting when they are entered by a physics body like our character, a kinematic body. The area is going to detect when a body enters it. So I'm going to actually, with my enemy selected under the node tab under signals, I'm going to double click on body entered, which is going to now ask me to point to a code file where I'm going to have to make a function that handles whenever this signal is triggered and is fired or sent out when a physics object like our character enters this area. Now, in the last video, we used signals like this in order to make a button switch us from one scene, our menu, back into our level. And in that case, we actually gave the button its own script file, and so the button actually handled its own event or its own signal. In this case, our enemy is going to send a message to our character, Steve. So I'm going to select Steve, and on Steve's code, and Steve does have a script file, in his script file, I'm going to make a new function or a method called onEnemyBodyEntered. So I'm actually going to get rid of this enemy one part, the one part, so just leave it at enemy because we're going to reuse this for every enemy in our scene. And I'm going to press connect. So Steve is selected. I change this method name here. I'm going to press connect. And when I do that, we've now been jumped over onto Steve's code. I can click on this little icon there, and you can see that's where we are. And if I look at the bottom of our code, here it is, function onEnemyBodyEntered, and it's given us this little temporary pass line, which I need to replace to actually do something. And if I look at my enemy, it now has a little signal icon. And if I have it selected in my scene dock, you can see that it is being handled. This body entered is being handled by Steve, and it's calling a method or function called onEnemyBodyEntered. So now we know it works the way we want. Now, what are we actually going to do if we come into collision with our enemy? Well, we need something to happen, and for now, I'm just going to use a test method called print, just to make sure that everything is working the way that we want. And then I'm going to make a very quick game over screen. So on Steve's script, I'm going to replace this pass line with a method call to print. And this is not a function that you can use when you export a game. It's just for testing. And what you can do here is you can put double quotes in this method call's round brackets, and I'm going to put hit. Okay, I think you might have seen this in the very first video in which I talked about programming. This print method is built into Godot, and you can call it to print something or text down in the bottom output window while you're testing a game or playing a game just from the editor here. So let's go ahead and play this scene, and hopefully if I hit an enemy, it will say hit down with an exclamation mark down in the output dock at the bottom. Okay, let's go and see what's happening here. We're getting lots of hits because this enemy is hitting other things, I believe. It might be hitting the wall or the floor, so we need to be a little bit more specific. So when the enemy has a body enter it, I'm going to check to see if the body's name is Steve, because we've named our character Steve. And that way it won't give us a false hit printout if it's hitting something else. So I'm going to write an if statement. So I'm going to press enter to move that one line down. And I'm going to write if body dot name is equal to, in quotes, I'm going to put Steve, because that's the name of this node that I've given it in the scene doc. And I'm going to put a colon at the end of that line. And now I'm going to indent this next line because it's going to be the result of this if statement. So I'm going to put my cursor there and press tab once. Okay, let's go and see if that works. I'll do a Control S to save, and we'll play this scene. And now you see that we're not getting that hit happen automatically, but now if I roll my ball into the area, you're seeing that every time I move my ball into the enemy, I'm getting a hit. If I roll it in once more, it's going to detect a hit. Okay, so it's working exactly the way that we want. It's detecting a physics body entering it, and it's only going to do something when that object happens to be Steve. So let's go ahead and very quickly make a new screen, a new menu. So I'm going to press this little plus button. We're going to go back into 2D view. I'm going to make a user interface scene, and so a control node. See it, and if I click on the play again button, it should take me back to the menu, which it does, and now I can play my game. Now we just have to connect up hitting the enemy to go to the game over screen. I'm going to let this load my level though. There we go. Okay, so now it's getting us there, but it's not actually taking us to game over. It's printing hit down here. So last but not least, almost, we're going to go to our level and look at my Steve code, because Steve handles his own collision with the enemy. So I'll click on my script file, and instead of printing hit here, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to get the tree and change the scene. It's the same code as the button, or any of the buttons that we've made before. So get underscore tree, and then a dot, and change underscore scene, and round brackets, and I'm going to change to game over. So I can just click on my game over on the bottom left and then copy this path, Control C, and paste it in here. And I think we are almost good to go, but I think it will work. Let's go back to our, in fact, you can pause the video if you need to get that. But there it is. Let's go ahead and try this scene out. There we are. So now if I roll into the enemy, I go to the game over screen, I can play again, I can go back and press play on the menu. And so now I'm in my level again. If I hit it again, I go to game over. I think you get the point. If I don't hit the enemy, I won't go to game over. So we've got one enemy. And this is the last part in this video. I'm going to duplicate my enemy. And there's a reason why I named it, I think, enemy 1. Its default or root node is called enemy. So on our level, it's enemy 1. If I right click on enemy 1 and I say duplicate, I now get enemy 2. The problem is this animation player, or enemy 2's animation player, has this enemy 1 animation in it. And the reason why we didn't put this animation player in our enemy scene is exactly for this reason, because we want to have a different animation play on each individual copy or instance of the enemy. So I wouldn't be able to access it as easily if I had put it in the enemy scene, because I wouldn't be able to click on it here in my scene doc. Okay, so that explains why I didn't do it that way. I'm going to actually go to on enemy 2's animation player. I'm going to click on the word animation. I'm going to say new, and I'm going to name this one, surprise, surprise, enemy 2 animation, and press OK. We've got a new animation, and I'm going to move enemy 2, which is in the exact same spot as enemy 1. I can go back to my top view and then orthogonal, and let's move the enemy. Ooh, where do we want this one? It's really up to you. I might make one that simply goes back and forth here. It's really up to you. So again, I can put it where I want to start, and then click on enemy 2 under the inspector, and I can change the transform keyframes by inserting a track with the little key button. So I'm going to insert a keyframe of it right there. Yes, I will. and that's at 1 second in. In fact, I'm going to move that keyframe just by dragging it down to 0. This is going to be a little bit of a different animation. I'm going to have it pause here, and then it's going to move, and then pause here, and then move, and then again repeat that pause. So this action is going to be 1 second of pause, 1 second of motion, 1 second of pause over here, and then 1 second of motion. So that's 4 seconds altogether. So I'll change my value over here. This action is going to do autoplay, and it's going to loop, and I'm going to make it stay there for a second. So I'm just going to duplicate this keyframe, right click, duplicate keys. So this line means it's staying still. If you're familiar with Blender's dope sheet window, you'll be familiar with something like that. And now I'll have it move. So at 2 seconds, it's going to move over to here. And I need to get my enemies. I'll click on my enemies and click on its key next to translation. And now I'm going to have it stay there for a moment. So I'm going to duplicate that at 3. So I'll say right click, duplicate keys, and then it actually wants to snake back for some reason to its original position. I'm not sure why that is. I think that's why we had the problem before where it rotated in a funny way. So I'm going to go back to 4 and just insert a duplicate of the first or second keyframe there. So right click and duplicate keys, so now it actually knows to go back there properly with its own actual keyframe. So I'm not going to bother doing the rotation animation for this one, but let's go back to perspective so we can see our lighting and shadows. Do a quick Control S, and the only remaining thing that we need to consider is, does this enemy collide? Let's go ahead and try that out. I'm going to press play the scene. And here we are in our game. You can see my enemies moving back and forth. It's not spinning or rotating, but we can add that later. I can happily move around my level, but if I happen to bump into that enemy, yes, it will go to the game over screen because, and I can go back to the menu and I could play again, but it's working because it still has a signal that if I were to click on that little icon, it takes me over to my node tab in the signals, and you can see when a body enters this copy, because I duplicated it, it connects to the same on enemy body entered method or function on my Steve, and so it works. And if I look at my Steve script, it still checks to see if the body that it detects is named Steve, and it changes the scene. So it all works as you would expect. So that will be it for this video. Of course, if you like this video or if you learned something, go ahead and click on that like button below this video on YouTube. It really helps me and my channel out. And if you want to see more videos like this one in Godot or Blender or technology, click on that subscribe button and click on the bell icon to get notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. Check out my Facebook page at facebook.com/borncg. On that page, I post pictures and previews and sneak peeks, and I communicate with you, my viewers, the most there on my Facebook page. But that will be it for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.